Now, I've decided to do this video a little bit differently than I usually do. The reason being is because I really feel this is an important topic to discuss, especially when reviewing physical media format, especially the 4K UHD format. So I've decided to show the comparison stills between the 4K and the Blu-ray throughout this film instead of just having their own separate comparison section. So you'll be seeing them side by side while I'm discussing this. Alright, so here we are with another very controversial 4K UHD from Universal American Graffiti. And many are reporting there are serious issues with the video quality. Some reviewers out there are saying this 4K is a complete disaster. It's a travesty to the 4K format, mainly because it's plastered from head to toe with very heavy amounts of DNR scrubbing, or known as grain management. Many declaring this as the worst 4K UHD title out there. Really? Have you seen Terminator 2? And the reason they're saying this is because the image is completely devoid of grain, making texturals and details look very plasticky and waxy. Even some saying it looks like it was shot on video instead of film. Now, I'm not saying there was no grain management applied to this 4K. There was. But before we fly off the handle about this, you first have to understand exactly what you're looking at here with this 4K. Otherwise, just being up in arms and yelling and screaming, declaring this a travesty to the UHD format, well, can make someone quite frankly look like they just don't understand what they're looking at or what they're talking about. Now, two things here that people reviewing this American Graffiti on 4K are forgetting about. One is the exact same use of grain management was applied for the 2011 Blu-ray. So this isn't just something that was new for this 4K UHD release. However, with the higher resolution of 2160p and the invent of all these modern TVs, it's much more apparent now than it was on the Blu-ray. And I noticed that it's mainly with just still talking heads. It's very noticeable. But when there's movement, it's not very noticeable. And the whole reason why I'm even making this video is that nobody seems to want to take into consideration with this UHD of how American Graffiti was shot. Now, first of all, this was not a Universal funded film. It was a low budget, independently shot film under very tight restrictions that Universal later bought. And George Lucas and his team use 2x film stock, which is much cheaper, and you can shoot longer than the studio favored 4x film stock. And American Graffiti was shot in 1972 under 2x film stock. Now, I did a lot of research on this, a lot of digging. I talked to different people that I know in the industry about this, and which is one reason why this video has taken longer to get out than what I wanted. But I found out that the master of cinema himself, Stanley Kubrick, favored to shoot his films under this exact same 2x film stock with such films as Barry Lyndon, The Shining, and other films. The reason being is because this type of film stock has far less grain than the more expensive 4x studio film stock, meaning not as much loss of details and texturals. Hold up, stop the presses, stop the review. I know what some of you are thinking out there right now and probably want to hear it in the comments. This is complete BS. 2x film stock does not have far less grain than 4x because 2x is a cheaper film stock, so it inherently has much heavier, chunkier grain structure than 4x film stock. However, is that necessarily true? I did reach out to a friend of mine who's also a renowned cinematographer. We did an interview with him on this channel as well a couple years ago. He's worked with 2x, 3x, and 4x film stock. He knows what he's talking about. And I asked him about 2x film stock because honestly, I wasn't very familiar with it. And the grain structure using 2x film stock in 1972 when this film was shot. And he wrote back to me, and this is what he had to say. Yes, I do know how Graffiti was shot. Lucas and Evazlaj, which is his DP, decided to shoot on 2x stock, which was produced by Kodak. Many films were shot this way, including Godfather, Duel, Dirty Harry, and more. because it was much cheaper than shooting on 4x film stock, and also saved time because you're able to shoot longer. As far as your question with grain structure, it all depends on how the scene was shot, the exposure, and processed. I'm going to read that again here, guys. It depends on how the scene was shot, with the exposure and process. And he also goes on to say, also depending on your lighting. You basically have the freedom to set your own grain field, meaning if you want less grain, as Lucas decided with Graffiti, then you made the adjustments. If you want thicker grain, then the same principle. And he goes on to say, I did see the new 4K print of Graffiti in a screening and it looks incredible. I had no issues with it. And the grain field looked the same as it did back in 1973, in the 80s, 90s, and the 2011 release. Some scenes have a finer grain, while other shots barely have any, almost looking non-existent. It's my guess Lucas shot when and how they could, and that's why we have fluctuations throughout the film. As for the 4K transfer, all I'm aware of is the print from 2011 that Lucas restored and tinkered with was harvested for this new transfer. What this means is that, in fact, the grain structure in American Graffiti did not originally or inherently have heavy grain or chunky grain, as a lot of people think it does. Instead, the film had much more resolved, finer layer of grain field. And that's exactly what we see here on this 4K. And when you're watching it, you can clearly see there is a very thin layer of grain in the background against walls and also out in the street during cruising and racing scenes. So the grain field is obviously there. It's just very, very thin. Another point is that American Graffiti was also shot using soft focus and opticals that inherently makes the image look softer, or as people love to say, waxy in certain areas. This was actually a technique that has been used on different movies, including Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Nicholas Meyer told me in an interview to keep the Enterprise crew looking younger at the time the film was shot. The crew of the Enterprise was shot under soft focus. And what this did is it smoothed out the skin texture, making them look younger, or they thought it did. While he shot Khan's crew not under soft focus, which is why the Khan's crew doesn't look waxy or what people like to say plasticky. And all these aspects you have to take into account, especially when reviewing a 4K UHD, because again of the higher resolution and all the bells and whistles it has, along with all the modern TVs. All these areas are just much more noticeable now. So again, the image is not devoid of grain. The grain fill that is there does give some nice texture. And areas where it looks like there is no grain looks pretty good. And I wouldn't say it's overly plastically or looks like it was shot on video and not film. Overall, I think the movie on 4K looks better than it ever has. Now, again, I'm not saying that grain management was not applied to this. There was a slight applied of DNR scrubbing on the 2011 restoration that Lucas did. And so, yeah, it is there. So between those two factors, yeah, it looks like that someone just went in there and scrubbed the entire image from head to toe, devoiding it of grain. Again, please, when reviewing physical media, especially a 4K UHD, don't just fly off the handle and do a knee-jerk reaction and say that this 4K sucks, that it's a travesty to the 4K UHD. It's just all about doing research and finding out about how a movie like this was shot so you know what you're looking at. Because here's the thing, physical media is already suffering. And when you put out reviews dissing a 4K UHD release that is making somebody not buy that, then you're just doing your part in hurting the format even more so. Now, with all that said, the real treat of this UHD is the color reproduction. The colors look outstanding, and that's the area where this UHD really excels over the previous 2011 Blu-ray. The various colors of the cars, from bright electric yellows to striking richer candy reds and ice cool blues, all looks terrific against the night background of the street and the racing scenes with all the vintage cars, especially scenes where the cars are parked at the diner. It just all looks very gorgeous. And it's all of these areas where the image really looks like a full 35mm film, allowing us to appreciate all of the finest. Skin tones look healthier and more natural. Another huge plus with this 4K that excels the Blu-ray is with the highlights, where car headlights and street lights are a little bit more natural now and visible and not as hot. Saturation is dialed in slightly, giving a little bit more life to the image than the Blu-ray offered. The Blu-ray did not suffer from any kind of black issues as far as bright or grayish black levels, but it did suffer from some serious crushing in areas. This 4K has fixed this issue with those deeper inky black levels and correcting the crushing that otherwise engulfed some of the finer details that was on the Blu-ray, which is very important since the film largely takes place at night. This 4K UHD is definitely not an atrocity, as some reviewers are making out to be. It's definitely not one of the worst UHDs out there. I've definitely seen a lot worse, but I've also definitely seen a lot better. But when comparing this to the previous Blu-ray, there are significant improvements in quality that definitely does make this a worthy upgrade. Alright, so I'm giving American Graffiti on 4K UHD video a 3.5 out of 5. It's not the best 4K UHD out there, but it is definitely worth an upgrade from your Blu-ray. So please, if you're thinking about buying this, don't be swayed to not buy it based on some reviewers that say that DNR was heavily applied and everything looks awful. And come back here to the channel and let me know what your thoughts on it is. Well, I want to thank you guys so much for hanging out with me and discussing the grain field and how this film was shot and used for the 4K UHD. Thanks so much for sticking around with this video. And yeah, like I said, I just wish that more reviewers would do more research before they just knee-jerk reaction to giving something a terrible review. As always, guys, keep physical media alive, and I'll see you next time.